Let's explore the basics of web page layout, and that means we need to understand the structure of HTML and CSS. So let's get started. In this lesson, we're going to start by identifying the foundational markup that's common in any web page. And then we're going to learn the syntax of HTML and CSS. Now, by learning these patterns, you will be able to write your own code statements, and you'll be able to leverage the code of other developers. That's great. The other thing we'll do is we'll take a closer look at HTML5 semantic elements, especially those that relate to page layout. So we've got a blank page with a web extension, let's say .html. And our first line is a declaration that tells the web browser, hey, web browser, this is written in HTML. And this particular declaration tells the web browser, hey, it's in HTML5, by the way. Then we add our HTML elements. We've got the open tag, and at the bottom we've got our close tag. And notice the close tag has an extra / in it. And this element tells the browser where the HTML code or markup is contained. Now, a couple of side notes. The first note is that HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So it's actually less code and more markup. And that's to say that we define or we contain content by using the open and close tags of an HTML element. For example, HTML starts here, here's all the HTML stuff, HTML ends. A paragraph starts here, here's the paragraph, paragraph ends. And it harkens back to the days of WordPerfect and Reveal codes, or XML, or the Karate Kid with wax on, wax off. All right, anyway. And the other point is that we can actually include with HTML inline blocks of other languages or other scripts. So we can have CSS and JavaScript referenced inside of the HTML. They all work together. Now within the HTML, there are two sections. There's the head and there's the body. All right. The head contains information about the page, and the body contains the content that's on the page, what we actually see. Now in the head we might have metadata like the title or the keywords or description or author. We also might have in the head extra scripts like the CSS or the JavaScript, and that could be written out internally, or more commonly, as we're seeing here, it can be referenced, a separate page written entirely in CSS. For example, we've got a page called Style that is written in CSS, and it's referenced, there's a hypertext reference to that page. And in the body, well, that's all of our layout, that's our content. That's what we're actually going to see on the page as viewers. So let's take a closer look at the body. Now the body most commonly is going to have inside of it a div tag, and that div tag is going to have a CSS class or ID assigned to it called wrapper or container. It's really up to you, but these are conventions that we use. And then inside of this div, we're going to have the header area and the footer area and the nav and the meat and potato and the contents, all that cool stuff. Now the div itself is great because it allows us as developers to define the alignment of the page. Is it center aligned or left aligned? And how wide is it going to be, 100% or fixed pixels, 960 pixels? How many columns we want to use? And if we're using responsive CSS, then we can tell this div how to adapt depending on the device. You know, is it desktop or tablet or phone? That's pretty cool. And then the headers and the footers and nav bars, we actually define it in HTML, but we use CSS to control the look and feel. For example, this aside, sometimes we call that the sidebar, could be over on the right hand side, or it could be equally divided, or we could even have a second aside. We have some options in there of how we're going to define it. And the content itself can be controlled and have lots of elements in there with images and paragraphs and more divs and all kinds of great stuff. But all this is being built around HTML. So let's take a closer look at the syntax or the pattern of HTML. We start with a tag. So this element is going to have a tag inside of these angular brackets Here's the open tag, and the closed tag has that forward slash. A tag can have an attribute, for example, a color, or a width, or a reference, or a source. And then the attribute is going to have a value. The color is red. The background color is blue. The width is 100%. The width is 360 pixels. Also pay attention to the orange areas. That's part of the key of this syntax. So here's an example. We've got a tag and it's called div. And the div has an attribute called class. Class is actually referring to a CSS class, and that's going to give us some formatting. And the particular class, the CSS style rule that we created was called attention, so that's the value. And hey, there's actually another tag here. We have another tag called strong. Strong is technically a semantic tag. Instead of saying bold, which determines the format and the look and feel, we're going to say this is strong information. This is important. And then we can use CSS to define how that might look. And then don't forget, at the end, we've got these closing tags. So we've got the closing of strong and the closing in div. And notice how they're nested, kind of like a club sandwich. You got the outside bread, and you got the inside bread, and it's delicious. Most of the tags in HTML are container elements that hold content. They've got an open tag, they've got a closing tag. For example, H1, H2 goes all the way down to H6. You got P for paragraph, you got A for link. Wait, what? It's for link, but it's called that for named anchor. You're like, what? Named anchor? That's just what it is. But the A is going to reference, there's an attribute, a particular page. Could be an external page, an internal page, or it could be a bookmark, which is also called a named anchor. Okay. Now, with any good language, there are some exceptions to the rule. So even though most of the tags are container elements, there are a few empty element exceptions. These are sometimes called void or singleton elements, and they don't really hold any content. They just are. And the two really main important ones would be an image and a break. So an image, I think you kind of figure out what that's for. It's going to have an image, and it's going to have a source that references where that image is. It could have an alt tag that shows up the text in case there is no image visible. It could have a width, a height, all kinds of different attributes. A break is a line break. And instead of a paragraph, you could have a quick line break. Another one that we might see is an HR. That would be a vertical, or excuse me, a horizontal rule, which just sounds strange, but it's just a long horizontal line is what it is. And for good measure, we should add one other element in here called a comment. It's kind of a special feature. And notice how it's written, there's syntax there. And comments are great because they allow you to put in content that does not show up on the page. And so we can add in a comment about where we're adding some script or what that script's going to do. We could also comment out a particular area. Instead of deleting that code, we just hide it, and then it's great for testing or if we want to change our mind later, etc. Now, HTML is going to work in conjunction with CSS. HTML is all about describing the content, structuring the content, but CSS is about formatting or stylizing the content. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So let's take a closer look at the syntax. We're going to have a selector, and a selector can be connected right to an HTML tag, or we can even make up our own selector. There's a lot of flexibility there. And then the selector is going to have a property assigned to it. I think a property is kind of like an attribute, a little bit. And then each property needs to have a value. So if we're defining, for example, the body. Well, there's our selector. It's actually referring to a specific HTML tag. And then we have the property of font, and then we have our different values that are associated with that. And we could keep going. Also, notice that there's a comment in blue here. We've got the / asterisk and the asterisk /. This allows us to add some notes to our CSS area, which is always helpful as a developer to remember what you did, because 6 months later you won't. And when we take a look at these selectors, we should verify, or we should define some of them. So we start with the HTML tag selector. This is where we're referencing a specific HTML tag, like H1, body, P, A, etc. But we also could reference our own selector. We could make one up, and we could use a class selector or an ID selector. And notice that the class selector here uses a period, and the ID uses a hashtag or a pound sign. Class selectors are if we want to be able to use this particular one, let's see if I can spell here, multiple times on a page. For example, attention. I want to be able to use this one as many times as I need on a particular page. Whereas an ID selector means that we're only going to use it once. So for example, we've got a div and it's the wrapper. There's only one of those per page. We might have a special form. There's only one of those per page. And here's some examples of a selector, an ID selector for wrapper and a class selector for attention. I also want to throw in one more. It's called a pseudo class, and this is sort of in between a defined selector and one that we've made up. They're common conventional selectors, and here's some examples. We use these often with the links, and when you hover on a link, it often will change colors. You're actually doing that by creating a pseudo class for the A, for the link hover. And notice the colon here is part of that syntax, and as a little bonus point, we added a comma. This allows me to define two separate selectors and give them the same format, the same rule. So I could say that both the hover is when you hover your mouse, or the active when your mouse is actually physically clicking on that link, are going to have the same color value. So I don't have to write a separate line and change it. Now, here's the best part. You don't have to memorize this stuff. And you're probably thinking, good, because I didn't. You have the ability to learn the patterns, and then you can look them up. So let's start with some references. These are just some links that you might want to go visit on your own, and they're great tools to help you get started, to go a little bit deeper, and to go even deeper with, let's say, some extra scripting with DHTML or JavaScript, for example. And these particular references go hand in hand with different platforms, because then you want to try them out, and you can use Notepad, which is a really good price, right? You can code it in, view it in your browser of choice. In fact, try viewing it in a couple different browsers because it might render differently. Or you can use some other software that is going to include some features like type it, or what? Spell it. Spell checking. They should have like one speak checking right there. And some of these are going to be free, some of them you pay for, and some of them are actually built to a special platform. They might even have some proprietary code. But the idea here is that you can use these different elements to create some great, exciting pages, and this is just the starting point. Now what you might want to do here is take a screenshot of this particular slide and put it into your OneNote or Evernote list where you're keeping track of all of your great notes. And then you can go back at your leisure and review these different sites and these different products and just see which ones might be a good fit for you. That'll be some good homework for you to go and practice on your own. All right, home stretch. HTML5 has semantic elements that are very helpful for working with content. Now, what does semantic really mean? Well, it means that these elements not only contain content, but they also imbue meaning as to what that content really is. And in the olden days, we used the div element and we assigned to it a CSS attribute of class equals header or ID equals header. But now with HTML5, we can use this header element, and it can actually contain the header, like the banner and the logo and the really big title. And then we can still use CSS to style it, but it has a semantic value associated with it. And search engines love semantics. It's great for SEO ranking and indexing. And semantic elements make it easier for us to repurpose or migrate our content. It also makes it a cleaner looking page, so when we're going back to review, it's easier to see where the header actually is, where the footer actually is, for example. And so if we take a closer look at the left column here, this first column, what we have here are the elements that are key elements that we would use in a basic layout. So you probably can guess what the header is for and what the footer is for, and the nav is for a navigation area. In fact, you could even have more than one navigation area if you wanted. And then you've got section, article, and aside, and those would be great for the content area, that main content, and you can add some semantic structuring. Now the aside is often a sidebar, a separate column of content. You could have separate 2 columns of content, and the section and article are a way to describe your main content. Okay, wait a minute. Section and article are confusing because they're almost the exact same, and it can be a little challenging, head scratching if you will. When should I use a section and when should I use an article? All right, well, let's turn to the example of a newspaper, because a newspaper has sections and articles and subsections. And the idea is a section is when you want to group things thematically, like a sports section or a real estate section. And you're going to have a heading in it. This is sports. And then inside the sports section, you can have articles. And articles, I give you the option of possibly syndicating this information, maybe repurposing it, maybe distributing it using an RSS feed, maybe a blog post or an actual news article or comments could be put into an article area. And if it's really long, you could have sections built into it as well. The truth is, there are no hard and fast rules. These are just guidelines, and you can set up any way that works best for you. Just don't overdo it. That's what I would recommend. Just don't overdo it. And we should also be aware that we still use non-semantic elements. We still use divs, and divs have been around for a long time. They're fantastic. And divs, or non-semantic elements in general, allow us to structure our pages, but we don't necessarily have related content or syndicated content. It's just allowing us to add some structure that we could possibly stylize if we wanted to. So for example, we use this div tag with the ID or the class of wrapper or container that allows us to stylize that entire page and make it center aligned and 960 pixels on a desktop browser. And then we can structure these. We could maybe put in another area that's just going to have a special background color, and it's going to have a border. And so we can create a div for that. And it's not really any group. It's just, we just want it to look a certain way. And this would be great for tables. Instead of using an actual table, we can use divs, and we can say on a desktop, it's going to have 5 columns of divs, and on a tablet, it's going to have 3 columns of divs, and on a smartphone, it's going to have 1 column of div. So it gives us some more flexibility of how we are organizing this information. And so there we go. We've talked about layout, web layout, HTML, and CSS. And here are our key takeaways. First of all, HTML and CSS use memorable patterns, and you are capable of learning those patterns. You can learn the syntax, and then the world is your oyster, as they say, because the code can be easily discovered. You can go online. There's lots of free resources, and there's books. And if you have some web software, a lot of that software actually comes with built-in reference tools to help you learn the code. And you can go and find out different snippets and ideas online from how do I perhaps create a navigation area that's horizontal with drop-down menus that might change to vertical if it's on a phone, you know, all kinds of fun things like that. And the other thing is that we can use semantic tagging to describe meaning and to add a little extra oomph to our pages down the road. Well, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.